She didn't believe in fairy tales. He didn't believe in love, but fate believed in them. To save the publishing house her father built with his bare hands, Elena made the most impossible decision of her life. She agreed to marry a man who saw love as a business tool. Adrian Blackwell had everything: wealth, power, control, but the one thing he didn't have was someone who saw the cracks beneath his perfect world. Their arrangement had rules, boundaries, an expiration date. But when a broken sprinkler turned their wedding into a soaked rooftop vow, when he gave her a library instead of roses, and when she saw him cry quietly over a page from a forgotten book, she realized something terrifying. What if pretending led to something real? What if the walls they built to protect themselves became the very things keeping them apart? And when time runs out, what will hurt more, walking away or staying for love? This isn't a story of grand gestures. It's a story of slow glances across shared coffee, of love letters never written because they were lived instead. If your heart longs for love that unfolds like a forgotten novel, soft, steady, and surprising in all the best ways, then stay with us. And before we turn the first page, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories, where every story begins with a whisper and ends in your heart. Now, let's begin. In a corner office, bathed in the pale gold light of a late autumn afternoon, Elena Carter, just 30 years old, stood quietly at the end of a long table that had once belonged to her grandfather. Around her, the air in the boardroom felt heavy, as if it, too, was waiting for someone to say what everyone feared. The door creaked open, not with apology, but with the certainty of someone who never asked permission. And there he was, Adrian Blackwell. His presence alone was enough to shift the atmosphere, calm, composed, and dangerously unreadable. Behind him, a stream of legal advisors filed in, their briefcases snapping open like declarations of war. No greetings, no smiles, just a single envelope dropped at the center of the table. "I trust you've all had time to review the figures," Adrian said, his voice smooth like glass, but sharp at the edges. "As of this morning, I hold controlling interest in the company." Elena didn't blink, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped her late father's old satchel, cracked at the seams. Like her heart. "This house of stories," she finally said, her voice no louder than a whisper, "was built by 3 generations of Carters. My father gave his life to it. You can't just—" "I already have," he replied, not cruelly, but with the detachment of a man reading aloud a weather forecast. A faint rustle swept through the room papers, breaths, trust unraveling. Leo, her childhood friend and now the company's legal advisor, leaned toward her. His voice was quiet. "It's true. The shares were bought legally. It's done." Elena's eyes didn't leave Adrian's. "Then, why are you here?" For a moment, something almost like amusement flickered in his eyes. Then he said, "Because I'm offering you a choice." She waited. "Marry me," he said, "for 1 year. On paper. In return, I'll return full ownership of the company to your family." Elena laughed, an empty sound in a room full of ghosts. "And if I say no," he didn't hesitate, "then I'll break this company into pieces so fast, you won't even recognize its name on the stock sheets." A long silence. Not dramatic, just the kind that hurts the ears when the future becomes suddenly unfamiliar. "Why me?" she asked, almost to herself. "There's a deal I'm negotiating. With people who value tradition, appearances. A wife, for them, is a symbol. You need this company to stay whole. I need a story that sells. That's all." She looked around the room at the silent faces, people who had taught her how to love words, who had read her first essays in this very building, who now couldn't meet her eyes. and she thought of her father, bent over manuscripts late into the night, whispering to her that books were more than paper and ink, they were legacy. She turned to Adrian. Fine, but it ends in 12 months. I keep my own place, and you do not touch editorial. He gave a single nod, already signaling to his legal team. We'll be married by Sunday. As she placed her hand in his, Elena couldn't ignore the strange chill in the air. Not the cold of fear, exactly, but the cold of standing on the edge of something vast and irreversible. When the room emptied, Leo stepped close. Tell me this is just strategy. Elena didn't answer right away. She sank into the chair her father had once sat in. Her eyes found the faded photograph on the wall, her family standing outside this building, smiling as if the world was simple. I don't care what Adrian Blackwell wants from this, she said at last. But I won't let my father's life's work become a footnote in someone else's portfolio. Leo placed a hand on her shoulder. You're braver than I've ever seen you. She shook her head. No, I'm just desperate. And somewhere deep in her chest, a quiet voice whispered, You've just stepped into something much darker than business. 3 days had passed since Elena agreed to the impossible. Now, she sat in the far corner of a glass-walled office that seemed too pristine, too perfect like a museum display, rather than a place where real lives could unfold. Adrian Blackwell's headquarters towered over the city on the 42nd floor. The skyline stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. But to Elena, it felt less like a view and more like a cage made of light. In front of her, a mountain of contracts weighted pages so dense they could rival the oldest law books. She pushed them aside. These demands are absurd, she said, her voice even but taut. How many public events am I expected to attend? At least 3 every week. Adrian replied without hesitation from his seat at the head of the table. 4. During charity season, my associates prefer visibility. Visibility, she echoed. You mean a wife who smiles on cue and says nothing. From the other end of the room, Adrian's attorney, a no-nonsense woman with silver-streaked hair, cleared her throat. Perhaps we can settle on 2 appearances a week as mandatory. The rest remain optional. Adrian gave a single nod. That works. But in exchange, the wedding must happen this Saturday. Elena's eyes widened. That's 2 days from now. I haven't even told my mother, she added, her voice dipping with disbelief. She'll understand, Adrian said, leaning in slightly. For the briefest second, his voice lost its edge. My investors from Tokyo are arriving on Monday. They value tradition, and part of that includes meeting my wife over dinner. Without you, the agreement could collapse. Elena stared at the papers, thinking not just of herself, but of the dozens of people back at Alder and Finch who depended on her. Her mother would have questions. But eventually, she would understand too. She lifted her eyes. Where would I live? I'm keeping my apartment, she said firmly. No, Adrian responded at once. You'll move into my penthouse. The illusion won't work if we're in separate homes. Then I want my own suite, with a lock. Of course, I have no intention of crossing any lines, he said with practiced calm. You can redesign the entire east wing if you like. I never use that side of the space. There was a pause. When their eyes met across the table, Elena saw something in his usually guarded expression. Not confidence, not command, something lonelier, softer. But it disappeared so fast, she almost doubted it was ever there. There's one more thing, Adrian added, pulling a velvet box from inside his jacket. He opened it. Nestled inside was a diamond ring that caught the afternoon sun and scattered light like a prism. It was striking, beautiful, and completely unexpected. Elena inhaled sharply. It's enormous, It belonged to my grandmother. Adrian said quietly. She made me promise to give it to someone who would marry me for who I am, not what I have. His chuckle was bitter. Strange how that turned out. Isn't it Elena studied his face? For the first time, she saw a man who didn't look invincible, just deeply human. She might still approve, she said gently. This may not be love, but at least we're not pretending it is. Adrian looked at her as if she'd said something he hadn't expected. Then he quickly returned to his formal tone. Sign the documents. Elena, let's get this behind us. She picked up the pen. As her fingers hovered over the signature line, she glanced across the table. His hand calm. Deliberate was trembling slightly. So maybe, she realized, she wasn't the only one terrified of what they were stepping into. And then, before she could stop herself, the question escaped her lips. Adrian, why this company? Why Alder and Finch? You could have taken over anyone. Adrian didn't answer her question right away. He leaned back slightly, as if weighing how much truth to reveal. When I was around 8, he said at last, his voice quieter than before. My mother gave me a worn copy of The Secret Garden, printed by Alder and Finch. He paused, as if reliving the moment. It was the first book that made me feel something. He gave a small, almost embarrassed shrug. I guess I've always had a soft spot for this company. Elena blinked. She hadn't expected that. The steel facade she'd seen since the beginning cracked just a little. There was history in his voice, a kind of reverence. Without saying another word, she signed her name. A fluid gesture. A quiet surrender. Well then, she said, sliding the contract back toward him. I hope you're ready for a crash course in publishing, because if I'm going to wear your name, you're going to learn why these books matter. For the first time, Adrian laughed. Not sarcastically, not rehearsed. It was startled and genuine, and it made her heart flinch. I wouldn't expect anything less from my future wife. Saturday arrived, cloaked in sun and soft wind, strangely calm for a day that felt anything but. In the bridal suite of the Marigold Grand, Elena stood stiffly in front of a mirror, trying not to hyperventilate into a linen napkin. The dress was simple, elegant, and clean, but her thoughts were tangled. I still can't believe you're marrying the world's most charming ice cube, muttered Nina, her lifelong best friend, as she adjusted the final hem. Although, I have to say, his taste in wedding venues flawless. It's just a 12-month arrangement, Elena replied, though the words felt like someone else had spoken them. Think of it as the world's most dramatic business internship. A soft knock interrupted them. Elena's mother stepped into the room, her eyes glassy with emotion. You look just like your grandmother on her wedding day. Mom, please don't cry, Elena whispered. If you cry, I'll cry. And if I cry, I'll look like I've been smuggling raccoons under my eyes. Her mother chuckled through her tears, still cracking jokes. Even now. She paused, her gaze serious. Are you absolutely sure? Sweetheart Elena opened her mouth, but before words could form, the shriek of an alarm ripped through the hallway. What now? Nina said, racing to the door. Outside, chaos had already taken over. Adrian's assistant, a young man named Evan, looked half-soaked and wholly panicked. Minor issue, he said, wiping water from his collar. The sprinkler system in the ceremony room sort of exploded. Exploded, Elena repeated. Well, someone thought it would be funny to test the fire alarm, he said, looking sheepish. We think it was your cousin Jonah. He's been telling the staff you're marrying a demon in a tuxedo. Elena groaned, lifting her dress and marching straight into the mess, downstairs. The once elegant ceremony hall now resembled a fountain in full display. Chairs were drenched. Tablecloths hung heavy with water. and Adrian was soaked from collar to cuff, trying to apologize to three unimpressed Japanese businessmen in stilted, broken phrases. Without hesitation, Elena stepped forward and bowed slightly. "Gentlemen," she said in fluent Japanese, "please allow me to express our sincerest apologies. In our culture, this would be a disaster. But in yours, I've heard rain on a wedding day is a blessing. Maybe the skies are sending us good fortune." The oldest among them studied her carefully, then broke into a faint, knowing smile. He responded in quick, melodic syllables. "He says," Elena translated, turning to Adrian, "that any bride who can speak his language and stay composed in a moment like this is far more valuable than a flawless ceremony." Adrian looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "You speak Japanese. I studied Asian cultures in university," she said, wringing water from her skirt. "You never asked." Just then, the hotel manager arrived, out of breath but hopeful. "We can reset everything on the rooftop terrace. It has a view of the entire city. Give us 30 minutes. "Perfect," Adrian said, brushing water off his lapel. Then he turned to Elena, eyes filled with something quiet but warm. "That is, if you're still willing to marry a man who now smells like mildew and regret." She glanced around the soaked room, at the puddles, the disarray, the drenched investors, then back at the man standing in front of her, sopping wet but still holding it together. "Well," she said, finally smiling, "at least we'll have a story no one else can top." "Well," Elena said, brushing the wet strands of hair from her forehead as she glanced at the chaos behind her soaked guests. Overturned floral arrangements, and her once elegant dress now clinging damply to her skin. She looked back at Adrian, who stood ankle-deep in the ruined venue, remarkably calm despite his dripping suit. "At least we won't forget this day," she added, half laughing, half exhaling disbelief. He smiled, a real smile. 30 minutes later, the scene had transformed. On the rooftop terrace above the hotel, under a sky brushed in soft amber light, they stood face to face, surrounded by hurriedly rearranged chairs, wind-swept petals, and a city skyline that watched like a quiet witness. As the officiant began the vows, Adrian turned to Elena, and just before the words, "I do," left her lips, he winked. She nearly laughed out loud. The moment should have felt absurd. It should have felt like a performance. But strangely, it didn't. "You may kiss the bride," came the gentle prompt. Adrian leaned in, his voice low against her ear. "Thanks for saving me downstairs. The investors are convinced. And when I decide to turn the entire penthouse into pastel pink, just remember this moment." Without missing a beat, Elena murmured back, "I'll be sure to remind you when I order floral wallpaper with flamingos." He laughed a warm, human sound. Their kiss was quick, poised for cameras. But when he stepped back, his hand rested on her waist longer than necessary. She told herself the flutter in her chest was nothing, just adrenaline, just exhaustion, definitely not something else. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwell," Adrian said, as the private elevator opened with a quiet chime. Elena stepped inside the penthouse. Her heels clicked against the polished marble as she took her first step. Then she froze. "You've got to be kidding me," she whispered. It wasn't just extravagant. It was breathtaking. Every wall was adorned with masterful oil paintings or modern sculpture. But what truly silenced her was the library. From floor to ceiling, rich wooden shelves wrapped around the room, holding thousands of books, first editions, leather-bound volumes, archival glass cases holding what looked like handwritten letters. She turned slowly. "You told me you cared about Alder and Finch because of a childhood book," she said. "You never mentioned this was a full-blown obsession." Adrian looked, for the first time, almost sheepish. "I might have downplayed it. She stepped closer to one shelf, her hand hovering just above the spines. Is this? No. This is a first impression of Pride and Prejudice. Isn't it? It is, Adrian said. Printed in the early 1800s. Fewer than 30,000 copies ever existed. This one's pristine. Elena turned sharply. And you just keep it out here. Books are meant to be lived with, not locked away, he replied, loosening his tie as if the conversation itself made him more comfortable. Though the humidity systems in here cost a fortune. She laughed. Librarian reflexes. I still want to put it in a vacuum-sealed vault. He raised an eyebrow. Librarian I was? She nodded. Master's degree in library science. I worked at the public library until my father fell ill. After he passed, I had to step into his place at Alder and Finch. Adrian's expression softened. You gave up your quiet life for the family legacy. She touched a carved bookend. I used to dream of a collection like this. One day, after everything else. Just me and the stories. Well, he said gently, it's yours for the year. And if you're interested, the back wing has a fully equipped restoration room. She blinked, overwhelmed. It wasn't just the books. It was the thoughtfulness behind it, the solitude she hadn't realized she'd missed. Without a word, she sank onto the leather couch at the center of the room. Adrian sat beside her, close, but not imposing. Are you all right? He asked. She stared ahead, voice barely audible. This morning, I thought you were just another man who crushed people under the weight of money and ambition. Now I find out you're a secret bibliophile hiding half the literary treasures of the modern world in your living room. Adrian chuckled. I'm sorry to disappoint you with my unfortunate fondness for old paper and poetic prose. Elena turned to him, studying him as if he'd just spoken in another language. No, she said softly. I think you're finally starting to make sense. Elena sat quietly, curled into the corner of the massive leather couch, watching Adrian from across the library, for the first time since they'd met. He wasn't wearing a suit. His feet were bare, tucked beneath him like a boy lost in thought. And the weight he carried in boardrooms had vanished into the shelves that surrounded them. Without his armor, he looked different, more human. Why didn't you tell me? She asked softly. Adrian glanced up. About the books. About any of this. When we first met, we treated each other like threats. You could have just said you loved literature. He hesitated. Then, with quiet honesty, in my world, caring is a weakness. If people know what matters to you, they know where to aim. My father always said emotions don't belong in business, that loving anything that doesn't make money is stupid. Elena frowned. That's not just cold. That's... She paused, searching for the right word. Tragic. He stood quickly, like he'd let too much slip. Let me show you your rooms. The east wing's been set up like you asked. They walked in silence, their footsteps soft against the marble, as they passed shelf after shelf of beautifully preserved books. She noticed something small, but telling Adrian's fingertips brushed against the spines as he walked, like he was greeting old friends. Elena followed him, not just down the corridor, but into the quieter truth of who he was. At her door. He turned to leave, but she stopped him. Adrian. He turned back. Would you want to have coffee tomorrow morning? We could talk about books. Real ones. Not merger contracts. He looked surprised. Then something flickered across his face, something vulnerable, unguarded. I'd like that. When her door clicked shut. Elena leaned against it, heart unexpectedly full. Maybe this arrangement wasn't entirely doomed. Maybe a man who preserved stories like sacred things wasn't quite the villain she'd assumed. Her phone buzzed. Nina survived your first night as Mrs. Millionaire. Elena glanced around her absurdly beautiful suite, then thought of the quiet, book-filled haven just down the hall and the man who lived there. Elena. Honestly, it's not what I expected. Nina. Oh no. Stockholm Syndrome Elena. He owns a first edition of Pride and Prejudice. Nina. OMG. Marry him for real. Elena laughed, climbing into bed. But as she reached to turn off the light, she had the strangest feeling that this year was going to unfold in ways no contract could have predicted. The next morning, she woke to the scent of coffee drifting through the air. Still in her robe, she followed the trail of classical music to the kitchen. And there he was, Adrian, barefoot again, in sweatpants and a worn university t-shirt, flipping pancakes like a man who didn't usually need to impress anyone. Don't look so shocked, he said, without turning around. Even emotionally stunted billionaires need breakfast. I just didn't have you pegged as the domestic type. Elena replied, accepting the mug he handed her. One sip, and she paused. You got it exactly right. Cream. No sugar. Adrian finally looked at her. I pay attention. Your assistant brings one to you every morning during your team meetings. 9:15 on the dot. She stared at him. Coffee forgotten. But before she could form a reply, his phone rang. In an instant, the warmth vanished. His shoulders straightened. His voice became clipped. What do you mean the agreement's at risk? He barked into the phone. Yes. I married her. Didn't I? Elena pretended to examine the backsplash tiles. No. Mr. Watanabe. Adrian continued, his tone hardening. She's not just anyone. She's exceptional. She speaks your language. She saved your guests from leaving yesterday. He glanced at Elena. Something softened. She's exactly what this deal needs. Elena stood quietly at the kitchen island, her hands wrapped around the warm mug. For the first time, she wondered if maybe she wasn't the only one who had started to care. Adrian ended the call with a clipped goodbye and dragged a hand through his already tousled hair. Change of plans, he said, exhaling slowly. The investors have requested to meet you tonight. Formal dinner. Here. Can you manage that? Elena blinked. Tonight he gave her a half-apologetic glance. It's important. Black tie. You won't be alone. I've asked my event coordinator to take care of the details. She tried not to let her voice crack. How many guests? About 50, he replied casually, as though that number didn't represent the entire weight of her anxiety. She nearly dropped her coffee. 50. Tonight. You just need to. He waved vaguely in her direction. Be warm, graceful, impressive. Oh, thank you so much for that deeply specific guidance, she said dryly. Adrian let out a breath that almost resembled a laugh. That came out wrong. You were exceptional yesterday. I mean that. He paused. Gaze lowered. I need this deal to work. And it's not just about revenue. Then what is it about? She asked, her tone softer now. Adrian hesitated, then shook his head, retreating behind the familiar wall. It's complicated. Before she could say anything more, his phone rang again. This time, she caught a glimpse of the caller ID, Father. She watched his face drain of warmth. I need to take this privately, he muttered, already heading down the hall. From the kitchen, she could still hear his voice, though it had dropped to that glacial, business-like tone. Yes. I remember our agreement. The marriage is strategic. Nothing more. The words landed like ice water across her chest. So, she wasn't the only one navigating family landmines. An hour later, Elena re-entered the study, dressed, composed, carrying her notes for the party. Adrian was already there, Suit back on, expression unreadable, surrounded by spreadsheets and silence. Without looking up, he said, "My staff has been briefed. You'll have full freedom over the event setup. The planner will arrive in 45 minutes. She stepped closer, gently. "Adrian!" He glanced up, clearly caught off guard by the softness in her voice. "Are you all right?" His eyes flicked away. "Why do you ask that call?" It sounded difficult. "Every conversation with my father is difficult," he said flatly. "It's nothing you need to worry about." She recognized a door slamming shut, even when it was silent. "All right," she said quietly. "But before I go coordinate this chaos, may I ask you something?" He nodded cautiously. "Why did you tell Mr. Watanabe that I was remarkable?" For the first time since she'd met him, color rose faintly to his ears. "You turned a disaster into diplomacy in under 30 seconds, he said. "You didn't panic. You found the right language, and you saved us. That's impressive. And," he added after a breath, "because I think you're more than I gave you credit for. Much more." Their eyes met. Something lingered between them undefined, but pulsing with possibility. Elena was the first to look away. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "I should go decide how to make 50 strangers believe we're in love." "Just be yourself," Adrian said. Then, after a beat, within reason, "Some of these investors still think Shakespeare is controversial." She smirked. "Don't worry, I'll be the embodiment of corporate grace." "Elena." She turned back at the doorway. "Thank you," he said, voice gentler now. "I know this isn't what you signed up for." She held his gaze. "To be honest, I'm starting to wonder if any of us knew what we were signing up for." As she made her way toward the waiting event planner, Elena couldn't shake the image of Adrian's face when it softened. Couldn't stop hearing the slight catch in his voice when he'd said she was more than expected. She had agreed to a year of distance, of detachment. But the more time she spent beside this complicated, guarded man, the more she wasn't sure distance was going to be so easy to keep. And tonight would be their first true test. Not just as a partnership on paper, but as two people who might just be becoming something else entirely. By the time the evening sun had faded behind the city skyline, Adrian's penthouse no longer resembled the modern fortress it once was. Soft lanterns floated above the terrace like glowing petals. A gentle breeze carried the scent of orchids, and the distant notes of a traditional Japanese string ensemble wove through the air like a lullaby. Everything gleamed under layers of refinement and restraint. Elena stood in front of the mirror, smoothing the midnight blue fabric of her gown, her fingers trembling slightly at the zipper. "You've handled publishing crises, legal negotiations, and death by budget spreadsheet," she whispered to her reflection. "You can handle a room full of billionaires, just 50 high-stakes investors, each ready to dissect her every gesture, all while pretending she and Adrian were hopelessly in love. No pressure." A knock at the door made her jump. Elena Adrian's voice came through. "The guests are arriving." She opened the door. He stood in a tailored tuxedo that looked like it had been made for him, and likely was. His hair was immaculately styled, his expression unreadable. But when their eyes met, something flickered. Not control, not calculation, something almost shy. "You look," he started, then cleared his throat. "That dress is appropriate. Appropriate." Elena arched a brow. "My heart, be still." A reluctant smile tugged at his lips. "Fine. You look stunning." "There," she said, stepping out. Was that so hard? As they walked toward the rooftop garden, his hand found the small of her back. "Remember," he murmured. His breath warm beside her ear. "We're madly in love tonight. Hopelessly enchanted," she replied. her smile polished to perfection. The next hour passed in a blur of introductions and soft laughter. Elena moved through the crowd with practiced ease, asking the right questions, offering thoughtful insights, switching between languages as needed. When she answered a guest's comment in fluent Japanese, several heads turned. She was in the middle of a lively discussion about eco-conscious publishing when voices rose in sharp contrast from the nearby terrace. She turned just in time to see an older man, silver-haired, imposing, standing too close to Adrian, his posture coiled like a spring. "You've always lacked backbone," the man hissed, "just like your mother." Elena excused herself from the conversation and crossed the room with swift steps. "Darling," she said with a smile, linking her arm through Adrian's. "Mr. Takahashi was just asking about our honeymoon plans." Adrian's father turned his icy stare on her. "Ah, the convenient bride. Tell me, Miss Carter, how much did my son offer for your loyalty?" Elena didn't flinch. "Actually, he offered to help me save my father's company, though after seeing his private library, I might have married him for the books alone," the older man scoffed, "still wasting time on those childish distractions." Adrian's voice was quiet, but laced with steel. "Those distractions taught me more about people than you ever could. They helped me understand empathy and behavior and how to build a company with soul, something yours never had." His father's face twisted with contempt. "Love. Empathy. You're in a business arrangement. Nothing more." Elena took a breath. Then she turned to Adrian and, on impulse, began weaving their fiction aloud. "Is that what you think?" she said. "Because I seem to remember your proposal coming right after you read me Shakespeare in the library." She smiled at Adrian. "You quoted Hamlet. Remember, doubt thou the stars are fire, but never doubt I love." He caught on instantly, his expression softening with play. "You forgot the part where you threw the book at me for being insufferable." "Well," she said, deadpan, "you were. But then," he murmured, stepping slightly closer, "you saw the first edition of Hamlet in my hands. And you realized any man who treats literature like treasure can't be completely hopeless." Elena laughed, letting her fingers brush against his. "Then you kissed me, right between the poetry shelves. For a moment. The world faded. The lights. The crowd. Even the harshness of Adrian's father's gaze. It was quiet. Soft. Convincing. Pathetic," the older man muttered, disgust lacing his voice. "You're both fools." He turned and stalked back into the room, leaving them alone on the terrace. Adrian exhaled. His shoulders fell. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Elena shook her head. "You don't need to be. He's a bully. I've known the type my entire life." She paused, then added, "But you defended the value of stories, of love. That takes strength." Adrian looked at her, truly looked, and for once, didn't seem afraid of being seen. Elena leaned against the stone railing of the terrace, her gown catching the breeze as the city sparkled below. After a long silence, she finally asked, "Was your mother really like you? Someone who loved stories?" Adrian nodded slowly, eyes lost in the lights beyond the glass. "She used to read to me every night. Shakespeare, Austen, the Brontes. Her voice made everything sound like magic." He paused, jaw tight. "My father hated it. Said she was making me soft. That books had no place in a real man's world. There's nothing soft about loving beauty." Elena said gently. "It takes strength to care in a world that tries to shame you for it." Adrian turned, his gaze sharp and searching. Why are you being kind to me? He asked. You said yourself this is a business deal. A contract. Maybe it is, Elena admitted. But that doesn't mean your father gets to belittle something that matters to both of us. Stories, books, they brought us to this moment. Even if not in the way I just told him. That counts for something. Before he could reply, music drifted from inside, not the gentle pluck of traditional strings anymore, but a soft, sweeping waltz. We should dance, Elena said with a small smile. I'm sure it's expected. Adrian raised an eyebrow, extending his hand in a practiced, almost formal gesture. Of course. Purely for appearances. Obviously. He led her through the crowd and onto the makeshift dance floor, where their movements slipped easily into rhythm, but as his hand settled at her waist, and their steps grew instinctive. Elena wasn't sure they were still performing. Thank you, he whispered, just beneath the music. For earlier. For standing up to him. That's what spouses do. Isn't it? She teased, but her voice came out quieter than intended. Apparently, he murmured. His fingers lingered slightly longer against her back, and Elena found herself leaning into the warmth of it. All around them, the guests smiled with approval. Mr. Takahashi lifted a glass and nodded, beaming. I think we're convincing them, Adrian said softly. Elena's voice slipped out before she could stop it. Maybe we're convincing ourselves. Adrian's step caught briefly, just enough for her to notice, before he recovered with practiced grace. Careful, Mrs. Blackwell. That almost sounded romantic. Must be the champagne talking, she said lightly. Of course, he replied. Neither of them mentioned that she hadn't touched a drop all evening. The next morning, Elena found Adrian standing in the library, motionless. A half-full coffee mug sat forgotten in his hand, the steam long gone. The pale dawn filtered through the glass, casting quiet shadows across his face. He looked younger in this light. And tired. I couldn't sleep either, she said gently from the doorway. He turned, startled. The party was a success. Mr. Takahashi signed the preliminary documents after midnight. That's great, Elena said, taking a seat in the nearby chair. So why do you look like you lost something important? Adrian stared at the skyline for a moment longer. Then, with a hollow laugh, he finally answered, My father called this morning. Elena's posture straightened. He's threatening to leak something about my mother, unless I agree to hand over my shares in the company. What kind of something? Adrian didn't look at her. The truth. A silence settled between them. She didn't die when I was 12, like I've always told people. His voice cracked slightly. She left, ran away, said she couldn't live with him anymore. Elena felt her heart twist. He was relentless, controlling. She tried to protect me for a while. Then one day, she just didn't come back. Elena stood and walked to him, her words soft but certain. That's not your shame to carry. Adrian, I was a kid, he said, voice barely above a whisper. But if this comes out, if people find out she chose to leave me behind my reputation, the company, the stock, it'll all take a hit. She didn't leave you, Elena said, placing a hand gently on his arm. She escaped him, and she probably hoped you'd escape too. One day. He looked down at her, the mask of control slipping at the edges, and for the first time, she saw not the billionaire, not the strategist, not the man in the tailored suit. She saw the boy who waited by the door for a mother who never came back. So, what now? Elena asked softly. Adrian straightened, his posture tightening. The executive mask slid back into place like armor being reattached. What I always do, he said. I fight. I take legal action. I find a way to shut him down and protect what's mine. And if the truth still comes out, she asked gently. His eyes cut to her, sharper than before. Why does it matter to you in 11 months and 3 weeks? You'll be gone. Back to your real life. Divorced. Free. The words landed heavier than he intended. He must have seen something flicker across her face because his expression faltered. Because I don't want to see you taken down by someone like him, she said quietly. Even if this started as a contract, I care. Maybe I understand what it's like to carry grief you didn't ask for. To feel like you're somehow responsible for a parent's pain. Adrian's features softened. Your father, he said. Elena nodded. He gave everything to Alder and Finch. His last day. He worked through the night editing manuscripts. I found him the next morning, collapsed over his desk. I used to think, maybe if I'd been more involved, more present, maybe I could have changed something. You couldn't, Adrian said firmly, just like it wasn't your fault. And it wasn't mine either. They sat there in silence for a while, surrounded by first editions, fragile paper, and the hush of a world still waking. Then Adrian spoke again. I have a confession. Elena's heart skipped. That's a loaded phrase. The Japanese deal. He hesitated, raking a hand through his hair in frustration. I didn't really need a wife. Takahashi is traditional. Yes, but he would have signed anyway. Elena blinked. Then why I saw an opening, he admitted. An excuse. A way to be near you without revealing how much I wanted to be. He looked up, the words tumbling faster now. I've been following your work at Alder and Finch for years. Every acquisition, every editorial decision you made to preserve your father's vision while bringing the company forward. You were fierce, brilliant, passionate in a way I didn't know how to be. Elena stared, stunned, silent. I told myself the takeover was about business. He continued, but when I walked into that boardroom and saw how you stood there ready to fight for everything that mattered, I panicked. The proposal just happened. I didn't know how else to keep you close. You could have just asked me out for coffee, she said, her voice breathless with disbelief. Adrian gave a self-deprecating laugh. I'm not good at normal. I'm complicated. Controlling. My father likes to remind me I'm emotionally defective. He stood abruptly. I'm sorry. I manipulated everything. If you want out, I'll dissolve the contract. You can have the company. No strings attached. Elena rose, walked to the window where he stood, and placed a hand gently on his arm. Adrian, she said, look at me. When he did, she saw him not the CEO, not the strategist, but the boy still bruised from being left behind. His walls, for once, had fallen. This is you, she whispered. No scripts, no performance. She took a breath. Do you want to know the truth, she asked. Last night, when you quoted Hamlet, even as part of the act, it made my heart stutter. He held still, listening. When you danced with me, I forgot it wasn't real. And when you look at books like they're sacred objects, like they're worth more than anything else in the world, I know I should be worried. But honestly, I think I might be in trouble. Adrian swallowed. Elena, I'm not saying I love you, she added quickly. We barely know each other, but maybe we could start there. Try dating, like normal people, while married. Is that completely insane? A slow smile stretched across his face, softening every sharp edge. Extremely, possibly revolutionary. She laughed. So, he said, taking a step closer. Dinner tomorrow night, no investors, no press, just us. I'd like that, she whispered. He reached out, brushing a lock of hair from her face. I should warn you I'm awful at dating. I'll probably talk about books the whole time. I'm counting on it, she said. As the morning light filtered through the tall windows of the library, casting golden patches on the floor, Elena felt something shift deep inside her, surrounded by shelves filled with love letters, epic journeys, and quiet truths. She realized this story of theirs, strange as it had started, was becoming something else, something unscripted, something real. "Adrian," she said suddenly, her voice barely more than a breath. He looked at her. "Your mother," she continued. "She shouldn't have left you. No, but she wasn't wrong to walk away from him. And whatever your father tries to bring down on you, we'll face it. Together." Adrian's hand reached for hers almost instinctively, fingers lacing with hers like it had always been that way. "Together," he echoed. "I like how that sounds." They slipped out a side entrance later that morning, both in worn jeans and soft sweaters, no suits, no walls, just two people walking side by side like something ordinary might bloom between them. "Where are we going?" Elena asked as they turned a quiet corner in Greenwich Village. Adrian just smiled. "You'll see." They walked for several blocks in companionable silence. At last, he stopped in front of a narrow storefront with a hand-painted sign hanging above the door. "Bookmark Memories, Rare Books and Coffee. I found this place when I was in university," he said, holding the door open for her. "The coffee is incredible. And the owner? Well, she taught me more about books than anyone else ever did." The moment they stepped inside, Elena felt like she'd entered another world. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves framed the cozy space. The air smelled like cinnamon, ink, and thyme. Armchairs with frayed velvet pillows sat in tucked-away corners like old friends waiting to be remembered. Behind the counter stood an older woman with kind eyes and a knowing smile. She looked up and lit up immediately. "Adrian," she called out in lightly accented English. "I was beginning to think you forgot me." He walked over with a boyish grin. "Mrs. Chen, how could I forget you? Mrs. Chen's gaze shifted to Elena. "Ah, and who is this beautiful companion?" Adrian's fingers slipped around Elena's hand. "Mrs. Chen. This is Elena, my wife." The older woman's eyebrows arched high. "Wife. You got married and didn't invite me? It was sudden," Elena said, smiling warmly. "But I'm starting to understand why he loves this place." Mrs. Chen beamed. "Come, I have something in the back you must both see. Just arrived." She led them through a disguised doorway behind a shelf of poetry. On the other side was a softly lit, temperature-controlled room that glowed with quiet reverence. Elena's breath caught. Are those Jane Austen's letters to Cassandra Mrs.?" Chen nodded proudly. "Authenticated just last week." Elena stepped closer, eyes wide, hands folded like she was in a sacred space. Adrian watched her quietly, the wonder on her face making something stir in his chest. "Mrs. Chen taught me everything," he said, almost shyly. "She found my first edition of Pride and Prejudice, the one you saw at the penthouse. That was you." Elena turned to Mrs. Chen, awe in her voice. "That copy is extraordinary." Mrs. Chen patted her arm. "Then you have good taste. Adrian needs someone who understands this love of his. Books were his refuge." The woman's eyes twinkled as she added, "Now, should I tell you the story about how he spent his entire trust allowance at 16 on a Shakespeare folio, Mrs. Chen?" Adrian groaned, face reddening slightly. But he was laughing, and Elena laughed with him. They spent the next hour among the treasures, Elena thumbing through pages older than her great-grandmother, Mrs. Chen sharing stories about a boy who came in alone and stayed for hours, who found comfort in characters when people had failed him. And through it all, Adrian stayed close, not hovering, not hiding, but open, real. It wasn't a grand gesture or a passionate kiss that changed things between them that day. It was this: a shared love for quiet pages, a rare bookshop in a tucked-away corner of the world, and the soft, unmistakable realization that maybe, just maybe, they were writing something worth holding on to, together. He had once camped outside this shop for 3 days just to be first in line for a rare Hemingway. He had learned how to verify watermarks and binding techniques long before he learned how to drive. Elena sat across from Adrian at a small wooden table, nestled between shelves of poetry and philosophy. Mrs. de Chen had just left them with steaming mugs of dark roast and a plate of almond cookies, still warm from her tiny back kitchen. "I had no idea," Elena said softly, running her fingers along the edge of her cup. "Your love for books. It's deeper than I realized." Adrian's eyes were distant as he traced the rim of his mug with one finger. "My father always saw it as a weakness. He thought books were for dreamers. But to me, they were survival. They taught me how to feel, how to see people as more than numbers. To understand that power isn't the same as value." Elena asked. He nodded slowly. "That love has weight. That broken things can be mended." She tilted her head. "Is that why you really wanted Alder and Finch? Not because it was profitable, but because it created those escapes for others?" "Maybe," he admitted. "I've built companies, made money, signed deals, but I've never made anything lasting, nothing beautiful, nothing that would outlive me." Elena reached across the table and took his hand. "You know, right before my father passed," she said, "he told me something I've never forgotten. He said the books we publish aren't just stories, they're letters to the future. Messages in bottles drifting toward readers we'll never meet." Adrian was quiet for a long moment. "That's beautiful," he also said. She added with a faint smile, "That love is like a good book. You have to pay attention, be patient, and sometimes be willing to be surprised." Their eyes met and held. Adrian's thumb brushed gently across her knuckles, the touch subtle but electric. "Elena, he started, then paused. His voice dropped lower. "I know how this began. I know I manipulated things. But somewhere between our chaotic wedding and that dance beneath the lanterns, I stopped pretending." She held her breath. "I started wishing it was real." "Adrian, you don't need to say anything," he said quickly. "When our agreement ends, if you choose to walk away, I'll understand. But I hope," he took a steadying breath, "I hope you'll stay. Not for the company, but for this, for us." Before Elena could answer, Mrs. Chen reappeared, beaming and holding something carefully behind her back. "I nearly forgot," she said. "I have a gift for the two of you." She held out a small, slim volume wrapped in linen. "A first edition of sonnets from the Portuguese," she announced with a flourish. "Elizabeth Barrett Browning." Elena's eyes widened. She opened the book to the familiar words. "How do I love thee, let me count the ways." "Mrs. Chen," Adrian began, startled. "We can't accept this. This book is worth nonsense," the older woman said firmly, eyes twinkling. "Some books are meant to find their people. This one's been waiting for a couple who understands that the best love stories are the ones we write ourselves." They left the shop hand in hand, the book wrapped carefully in archival paper. The late afternoon light stretched over Washington Square Park as they walked beneath the trees, golden leaves drifting around them. This wasn't just a contract anymore. Something had shifted. Something that felt like the beginning of a chapter neither of them had expected to write. "Elena," Adrian said as they passed the fountain. "Yes, ask me again in 11 months. Ask you what if I'll stay." He stopped walking and turned to her beneath the glow of the street lamps. "And what do you think you'll say?" he asked quietly. Elena smiled, thinking of love sonnets and rare bookstores and the way his eyes lit up when he talked about stories. I think, she said slowly, you'll have to wait and find out. After all, she added, the best stories are the ones that keep you guessing until the very end. Adrian laughed and pulled her close. And for the first time, Elena wasn't thinking about contracts or consequences, only about how right it felt to be here with him. You're absolutely right, Adrian murmured, a rare smile softening his features. It had been nearly 2 months since their first real evening together, not for cameras or contracts, but for themselves. And Elena had to admit being married to Adrian Blackwell had turned out to be nothing like she expected. Their days had grown into a quiet rhythm. Mornings with coffee and books, afternoons blending the soulful vision of Alder and Finch with the reach and precision of Blackwell Media, and evenings spent learning how to be real with each other. But tonight, everything felt different, because tonight, Adrian's father had called a press conference. He's really doing it, Adrian said grimly as he adjusted the cufflinks on his dress shirt. He's going to tell the world. They stood together in Adrian's bedroom, a space that had slowly become their space, though invisible lines still lingered between them. Boundaries, respect, time. Let him, Elena said, reaching up to smooth his jacket lapel. Whatever comes, we'll face it. Together. Adrian met her eyes in the mirror. You don't understand. If the press hears that my mother left me, that she's been living quietly in France all these years, they'll twist it. They'll paint me as a neglected child trying to cover a scandal. They'll see a man, Elena said, stepping behind him and resting her hands gently on his shoulders, who rose above cruelty, who built something with heart, not just money. He turned slowly, and you always know what to say. I was an English major, she said with a soft grin. It's kind of what we do. The press conference was held in one of the grand ballrooms at the Blackwell Grand Hotel. Reporters gathered in clusters, cameras flashing, tension thick in the air. At the back of the room, Elena slipped her hand into Adrian's, then came the voice that silenced the room. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Blackwell said, stepping up to the podium, his tone smug. I'm here today to reveal the truth behind my son's carefully polished image. But before he could continue, the heavy doors at the rear of the ballroom creaked open. A woman stepped forward, elegant and composed, her silver hair pinned into a graceful chignon. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her French accent still present, though softened by years of silence. That's enough. Richard, she said clearly. Adrian's breath caught. Elena felt his fingers tighten in hers. The woman at the center of the room was his mother, Vivian. Richard sputtered. You don't belong here. I'm here to speak for myself, she said calmly, stepping to the podium. Yes, I left when Adrian was 12, but not because I stopped loving my son. I left because Richard Blackwell threatened to take away Adrian's future, his education, his security, unless I disappeared. A hush fell over the room, followed by a wave of whispered shock. He wanted absolute control. Vivian continued, her voice trembling but unwavering, and I, believing I was protecting my child, walked away. Adrian stood frozen, pale, barely breathing. I watched from a distance, she said, eyes scanning the crowd until they found her son. I followed every business article, kept every headline, watched as you became a man full of conviction and purpose, despite everything. And now I see. You found someone who brings you light. Her gaze turned to Elena. I'm sorry. My sweet boy. I thought leaving would keep you safe. I was wrong. Adrian moved forward slowly, like waking from a dream. When he reached her, the room around them vanished. They stood face to face, years of distance hanging between them. "Why now?" he whispered. "I saw the photos," she said softly. "You were smiling. You looked truly happy. And I couldn't let Richard destroy that, too." Behind them, the room erupted again, questions flying, cameras flashing, security closing in on Richard as he was ushered away amid shouts about manipulation and threats. In the center of the chaos, Adrian wrapped his arms around his mother and held her tightly. Elena stepped back, instinctively giving them space, but Vivian reached for her, her expression warm. "You must be Elena," she said, taking her hand. "The woman who reminded my son how to feel. He taught me that books are more valuable than stock portfolios," Elena said with a tearful smile. "Mrs. Chen returned the embrace one more time before whispering, "Actually, I think you taught him that some takeovers lead to beautiful beginnings." That night, the penthouse was wrapped in silence and city light. Adrian sat on the edge of the couch, turning over a slip of paper in his hands, his mother's phone number written in elegant cursive. She had returned to her hotel, promising she would stay in the city for as long as he needed her. "She's been living in Provence," he murmured to Elena, "running a small publishing house that translates American literature into French." Elena smiled. "So, the passion runs in the family." Adrian gave a shaky laugh. "All this time, I thought she just vanished, that she didn't care. But she was protecting me in the only way she knew how." Elena sat beside him, the warmth of her hand resting gently over his. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "Everything I believed about my past, it feels like the floor beneath me just shifted. Maybe that's not a bad thing," she said softly. "Maybe now, you get to build something better, something real." Adrian turned to her, his gray eyes unreadable for a moment. "Elena, there's something I need to say. What is it I love you?" The words hung there, suspended in the quiet between them. "I know we have 9 months left on this so-called arrangement," he continued, voice low and steady. "But my heart stopped treating this like a contract a long time ago. I love the way you light up around books. I love your grumpy mornings before coffee. I love that you argue with me over grammar like the fate of the world depends on it." A small laugh escaped her, but tears shone in her eyes. "I love that you stood beside me tonight, when everything could have fallen apart." She reached for his face, cradling it in her palms. "You impossible man," she whispered. "I've been falling for you since the night you quoted Shakespeare just to irritate your father." Really," she said, smiling. "Though, if I'm being honest, I might have started falling when I first saw your library." Adrian laughed, leaning into her. "So what now?" "Now," she said, resting her head against his chest. "We write our own ending. No more contracts, no more pretending. Just us. And books. Always books," Elena whispered. They sat there as the lights of the city shimmered beyond the windows, no longer bound by paper or terms, but by something far more enduring choice. Love not written in ink, but lived in the margins between moments. It was never just a business deal. It had become their story. 1 year later, the ballroom of the same hotel glittered with warmth, laughter, and the scent of fresh flowers. This time, Elena stood in a different white dress. The guests weren't strangers. They were friends, colleagues from Alder and Finch, Adrian's reconciled mother, Mrs. Chen from the bookshop, and the people who had quietly watched 2 guarded souls unfold into something real. Nervous Nina whispered, adjusting Elena's veil. "Not at all," Elena replied, her eyes soft. "I already married him once. This is just us choosing it. Technically," Leo chimed in from his spot beside them. "Your original contract still has 2 weeks left. We're ending it early," Elena said with a grin. Because we want our real marriage to begin on our own terms. In another room, Adrian straightened his tie. His best man, James, handed him a paper rose. You could have just waited out the last 2 weeks, James said, half teasing. No, Adrian replied, pinning the rose to his lapel, a rose crafted from a page torn from Pride and Prejudice. This isn't about finishing a contract. It's about starting a life. Elena deserves a real wedding, Adrian said, adjusting the collar of his suit jacket. One with real vows. With people who love us for who we are, not what we can bring to their balance sheets. Your father's not exactly taking the news well, James remarked, straightening his own tie. Adrian shrugged with cheerful indifference. Considering he's currently under investigation for blackmail and corporate sabotage, I think he's got bigger things to worry about than my wedding guest list. The ceremony was simple and perfect. Vivian walked Adrian down the aisle, her arm wrapped tightly through his years of absence, erased by the quiet joy in her eyes. Elena's mother gave her away, radiant with pride, her cheeks flushed with happy tears. Even the same officiant from their first legal ceremony was back, this time with a knowing grin. Dearly beloved, he began, we are gathered here today again to witness the marriage of Adrian Blackwell and Elena Carter. Although technically they are already quite married, they've decided to do it properly this time. Not for business, but for love. Laughter rippled softly through the gathering. When it came time for vows, Elena turned toward Adrian, her voice steady despite the emotion that shimmered in her eyes. Adrian, she began, a year ago, you walked into my world like a hurricane dressed in designer wool. You were commanding, impossible, and had the most breathtaking library I'd ever seen. A warm chuckle passed through the guests. You offered me a contract, she continued, but what you gave me was far more an invitation to know the man behind the empire, the man who quotes Austen in secret, who makes pancakes on Sunday mornings, and who treats books like sacred relics. I thought I was saving my father's company, she whispered. But you saved me from a life that was all structure and no soul. I love you, not for what you've built, but for who you've become. For the heart you finally let breathe. Adrian's voice was thick with emotion as he began. Elena, you once called me the most arrogant millionaire in New York. You were, she teased under her breath. I was, he admitted with a smile. But somehow, you saw past it. You saw the boy I'd buried under strategy and steel. And you didn't run. You taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness. That strength can be found in softness. That the best stories are the ones you don't plan. He paused, looking into her eyes. You turned our contract into a journey, our merger into a love story, and I promise to spend the rest of my life proving that even the coldest negotiations can end with a happy ending. When the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," there was no hesitation. This time, their kiss was long, unguarded, and full of the promise they now understood: no more pretending, no more deals, only love. At the reception, Mr. Takahashi raised a glass to Adrian and Elena Blackwell for proving to an old man that the best business decisions are made with the heart. Mrs. Chen added warmly, and for showing us that sometimes you must lose everything to discover what truly matters. As they shared their first dance, a smoky jazz version of Can't Help Falling in Love, Adrian leaned close and whispered, "How's this for a merger and acquisition?" "Perfect return on investment," Elena replied, her cheek resting against his shoulder. "Maximum emotional dividends. I love you. Mrs. Blackwell. The real Mrs. Blackwell," she corrected with a smile. "I love you too, even if you are still a bit arrogant. Only occasionally. Don't test me. Later." as they cut into a wedding cake decorated with tiny edible books and gold-foiled spines. Elena noticed someone at the back of the room, an older man, tired, watching with unreadable eyes. "Your father came," she said quietly. Adrian followed her gaze. Richard Blackwell stood for only a moment, raised his glass in a quiet, unsmiling toast, and then turned, disappearing into the night without a word. "Let him watch," Adrian said softly. "Let him see what he lost choosing power over connection." He turned to Elena, "Because we have everything he never understood, joy, partnership, and," he smiled, "a truly spectacular library." 5 years later, Blackwell and Finch Publishing was the most celebrated independent press in New York City. Its success wasn't just measured in awards or profits, it was in the voices it elevated, the stories it preserved, and the quiet way it held onto the soul of literature in a world that often forgot. Elena ran the editorial division with fierce grace, curating voices that mattered and stories that stirred. Adrian oversaw the business side, his strategic brilliance now grounded in something deeper than ambition. Together, they built something enduring on the page and at home. Their twins, Isabel and Thomas, were growing up in a penthouse lined with bookshelves instead of screens. Every night, they fell asleep to the sound of stories told by two parents who knew, intimately, the power of a love that doesn't begin perfectly, but endures beautifully. Vivian visited often, arriving from Provence with books in French and cookies in tins, her laughter echoing through the apartment as she made up for lost time with the kind of love that never rusts, only waits. One evening, as the city glowed beneath their windows, Elena curled into Adrian's side in the heart of their home, the library. First editions and soft lighting, jazz playing faintly from the corner. She turned to him, a smile playing on her lips. "Remember when you asked me to stay?" Adrian looked over at her, eyes soft with memory. "And you made me wait 11 months for an answer." She laughed. "Good thing you're patient." He kissed the top of her head. "Good thing you were worth waiting for, outside." New York shimmered with possibility just like it had the night their story began. Some love stories don't start with fireworks. Some begin with stubbornness, with skepticism, with the wrong words and unexpected timing. Sometimes they start with a contract and end with a promise. Sometimes they begin with, "I don't believe in this," and become, "I can't imagine my life without you." Sometimes they say "I do" twice. And sometimes the best stories aren't the ones written in novels. They're the ones you live day by day, chapter by chapter, side by side. In the end, Elena and Adrian didn't just fall in love. They grew in love, built it, chose it. And every night, as they tucked in their children with stories and kisses, they knew the happily ever after wasn't a grand ending. It was a quiet, continuing beginning, the end, and also just the start. "We write our own ending," she whispered, nestled in his arms. "No more contracts, no more pretending, just us. And maybe that's what real love is, not perfect, not planned, but chosen. Every day. From a boardroom deal to a library full of sonnets, their story reminds us that even in the most unlikely circumstances, something honest, lasting, and extraordinary can grow. Because sometimes, the best love stories don't start with "once upon a time," they start with "I hate you" and end with "I do." Twice. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories, where we bring you tales that heal, inspire, and stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Thank you for listening. Until the next story. Keep believing in the beauty of unexpected beginnings.